My name is Pastor Andrew. For those of you who don't know me, I am the student pastor here. Pastor Jeff is out of town for the next couple of days anyway, preaching at a revival, church doing a revival in, I think, the big town of Beaver Dam, which is in Cumberland County somewhere. Do not ask me where that's at. I have no idea. I can tell you where Beaver Dam is in Columbus County, but I have no idea where it is in Cumberland County. But be praying for him. He's there. He'll be there today, this morning, tonight, and up through Wednesday, I believe. So praying that God will certainly do a lot through his time there. So, how many of you guys would say that you have heard the term or the phrase, "I will never do that"? How many of you ever said that? Right? I will never do that. So growing up, I always thought how crazy it was how my dad would fall asleep as soon as he would begin watching TV on the couch. Amen. Some of you can identify with that, but he would start falling asleep every time, and it didn't matter what it was. It could be the Super Bowl. It could be, I'm a NASCAR fan, don't hold that against me, but it could be biggest NASCAR race, Daytona 500. It could be anything you could think of. World Series, like he's out 10 minutes. He is probably watching, by the way. But I would be like, man, that's so crazy. How can you fall asleep in the most important things that are on TV, sport-wise or whatever? And never could get an answer for that. And I told myself, I'm like, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to be like that. I am never, ever doing that. This past Thursday, Brittany and I, Friday, we celebrated our 5th year wedding anniversary. And so, yes. Pray for her because she has to deal with me, all right? But we celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary, and as many of you know, we will hope in the next month or less, couple weeks, then God will hopefully usher in a healthy, not hopefully, I believe he will, and he is, everything's going good, but a new baby into our life and into our family, and so we're excited about that. But one of the things we're like, Thursday, we'll celebrate our anniversary, go out to dinner, and then we're going to come back and we're going to watch Black Widow. It's now on Disney+. We had not seen it yet, and so we were going to go watch that. 15 minutes into the movie, I'm getting nudged, and Brittany's like, "You're falling asleep again." I'm like, "No, I'm not." And then I've had a very, very strong recollection of something that I used to take the remote from my dad, and he would say, "Wait, I'm watching that," although he's asleep. And then I have realized I have become my father. And then I went a step further, and not only have I now started doing the things that I said I would not do, I now kind of get a picture of what it looks like to be old. And I get it. Some of you are like, "You have no idea. Just wait," right? So anyway, there's that. But I bring this up because in Daniel chapter 5, in chapter 5, we meet the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. And after Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is gone. He's died. He's gone away from the scene. About 20 years or so have taken place. And maybe Nebuchadnezzar's grandson that we're going to read about today, maybe he thought, "Man, I'll never be as prideful as my dad or my grandfather. I'm never going to do this. I'm never going to do that." Maybe he did. However, we're going to see today that the apple does not fall far from the tree. And so in Daniel 4, if you guys were here last week, you remember we saw the grace of God on display where God humbled down one of the greatest leaders in the ancient history. He repents, he turns his life, and what I believe, turns his life over to the Lord. And then now in Daniel chapter 5, rather than seeing a lot of grace as we saw in Daniel chapter 4, there's still grace in there, but what we're going to see today is that God is going to step in and knock Nebuchadnezzar's grandson back to reality, and it is not going to be as nice as it was in Daniel chapter 4. Remember the last words of King Nebuchadnezzar. He said this, he said, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heavens, because all his works are true, all his ways are true, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." So in Daniel 4, we got the conversion of a pagan king who turns and repents and comes to know the Lord. However, in Daniel 5, we see what happens when those who choose to rebel against God face his divine judgment. So let me paint a little bit of the historical context, really, before we dive in. So the Babylonians at this point are still in control. They're still ruling the Roman Empire. Now remember, at this point, they've invaded Israel 3 times. They've taken items from the temple. We're going to revisit that story here in a little bit. The exiles have now been taken from their land. Israel, the nation of Israel, been pulled out of their land, and they have been indoctrinated into a culture worshiping false gods and doing all these things that go against their God and the God of Yahweh. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, who's crowned one of the greatest leaders of all time, as I've mentioned, has already died. About 20 years or so have passed, and his son and his grandson could not live up to the standard of leadership that Nebuchadnezzar has set. And so we start to see a lot of things kind of spin out of control. So about 23 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, we get to Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. And what we see is that King Belshazzar is going to learn in one of the most difficult ways the truth behind the final words of his grandfather, that God is able to humble those who walk in pride. So it's really not a good story from a standpoint of one to sit through, but we're going to go through it today very quickly because we have 31 verses to go through. But the question that we need to really consider and think about as we look at this, and the question that we need to really ask ourselves is this: how are we walking? How are we walking? How are we living our life? Are we somebody who's filled with pride, or are we somebody who walks in humility? Because the main idea of what we're going to see in this text today, the one-sentence summary of the text is this: God sees our sin, and he brings his judgment on those who choose to remain unrepentant. That's the message of Daniel chapter 5. And so if you guys would, if you're there, let's stand together. We're going to read particularly from verses 25 through 28. And then we're going to pray, and then we're going to dive in. So Daniel 25 is 5:25 is where we're going to be. And we'll read through verse 28. If you're there, say you're there. You're there. All right. I'm there. You're there. We're all there. Here we go. This is the word of the Lord. Here's what it says. This is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, and parson. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighed on the balance and found deficient. And parson means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Let's pray together. Father, speak to us today. It's your word that teaches us. It's not our opinion. And so, Lord, touch our hearts this morning. May we leave here more in love and in touch with you than we've ever been. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. You guys have a seat. So the old saying goes, the handwriting is on the wall. The handwriting's on the wall. Title of the sermon for today, by the way. But the handwriting's on the wall, and I believe it's not only on the wall for this pagan king here in Daniel chapter 5, but it's also on the wall for us. There's 4 things. There's 4 movements of what I would say is in this text that we're going to cover. Number 1, God sees our sin. God sees our sin. Number 2, God confronts our sin. Number 3, God exposes our sin. And then number 4, God rightly judges our sin. And so let's start with the first one. We're going to pick it up in Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. I hope y'all are ready to read today, because we're going to let this text really preach this to us. So here's what it says. King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine in their presence. Under the influence of wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines could drink from them. So they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine. They praised their gods made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So what is happening here? Well, the text tells us exactly what's happening. There's a major feast that's taking place. And ironically, this feast is actually taking place on the very night that the Babylonian Empire, the great ancient empire that it was, is going to come to an end. Because as Belshazzar and his friends, his nobles, these 1,000 people that are at this great feast, is having this awesome party, according to them, the Medes and the Persians are out planning their attack that's going to take place later that night. Kind of ironic. So one of the things that we need to understand here is that this party wasn't just a party. In our terms today, this party was a kegger. This was an all-out kegger kind of party. I don't know from experience what that means. I just know that what it means, all right? Never been to one of those. Some of you probably have, all right? But the term that really is best describes the events that's happening there is not just the fact that people are drinking, all that kind of stuff. It's an orgy. An orgy. That's the term that most people describe this party. And so he invites all these people, thousands of people, to come alongside him, to come and enjoy this wine and drink and gluttony and just all these things that are going on. And actually, in ancient days, it was not normal for a king to do this. The king would never get drunk or be exposed in any way or shown out of control around his noble people. Would never happen. But being the self-centered ruler that Belshazzar is, he wants to be the center of attention. And so during the event, at some point, he starts to get a little loose. Everything's flowing, everything's good, we're having a great time. Again, people are indulging in gluttony, drunkenness, inappropriate sexual intercourse, you name it, it was happening at this party. And so at some point, this king gives an order that eventually leads to his doom. So he goes and he calls out to one of his people there in the palace, and he says, hey, go get those items that my grandfather Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple of Yahweh. Go get those items, because we're going to just take those items and we're going to use them as something for us to drink and party with. So the sacred things of God have now become pretty much meaningless and useless items in his sight. And so continuing in his bad decisions, he takes it a step further. Not only did he go and he take these utensils, bring them into the palace and start doing things, they started drinking wine out of them and praising their gods of gold and silver, bronze, wood, iron, and stone. A couple problems here. Number one, we actually see him devalue God. That's the first thing that we see. He devalues God in a sense that he takes these items and he turns them into nothing. Like, you guys think about it. Now, some of you may have like fine china in your house or whatever that you leave sitting up. I don't do that, but some of you may have that. But one of the things that you don't think about is the fork that's being really special that's sitting in your drawer at home. You probably don't think about it, right? And that's literally what he does. He's turned it into just some useless common item. And so we see him devalue God. But not only does he devalue God, he doesn't stop there. He then elevates his gods up and starts praising the gods of Babylon. And I think Danny Aiken, the president at Southeastern Seminary, said it well, and he put it this way, that Belshazzar believed that what he was doing was going unnoticed. That what he was doing was going unnoticed. And as if God was just not paying attention to the events that were happening here on earth. And if we're honest, many of us may not admit this, but if we're honest, sometimes we live our lives that way. We live our lives thinking that the things that we do kind of go unnoticed, and that maybe God's not paying attention to the sin or the things that we keep running to in our lives, or elevating to being more comforting than him, and all those kind of things. Because a lot of times, people have these thoughts. No one's looking, so who cares if I take some of this money that's not mine? As long as I clear my search history, my wife or my husband won't find out what I'm looking at. Or delete these messages, no one will know. It's just casual flirting at the office, so what's the harm in that? Nothing's going to happen. It's just a small lie, who cares? Church, I'll tell you who cares. God does. God cares quite a bit. And if there's anything that we learn here in Daniel 5, it is that. I once heard a pastor say one time that what really breaks the heart of God is that when God's people intentionally choose to pursue and go after other things over him. God sees our sin. God sees exactly everything that we're trying to cover up. And what we do see is he does notice it. And when we sin and we make the choice to go against God, you can bet that while you think you're covering up, he sees it. He sees it. So, God sees our sin. Point number 2, God confronts our sin. Let's keep reading in these verses. Pick it up in verse 5. It says, at the moment, the finger of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace, the wall next to the lampstand. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face turned pale. His thoughts so terrified him, I love this part, that he soiled himself and his knees knocked together. Now, some versions of your Bible do not mention that part. But the CSB, being as close as the literal translation as it can get and the most readable, I believe, is taken straight from the Aramaic that it's written in. So at this point of the party, everything is everybody's out of control with reality. Drinks are still flowing, people are dancing, people are having a good time, doing things they shouldn't do. However, we see that the king and his guests are quickly brought back to reality because a hand starts writing things on the wall, a disembodied hand, by the way. And in a moment's notice, the king is brought back to his senses, and I believe sets the record for the quickest time that anyone has ever sobered up from a drunken state. Not speaking from experience, all right? Just saying. And so he comes back to his senses. And so from verses 5 to 7, the man goes from a break with reality to a check with reality. And so suddenly, Belshazzar is yanked into the seriousness of this moment. And so what does it take to snap him back to reality? It is literally the finger of God writing on a wall. And I believe that in the spirit of Halloween, that probably had to be the freakiest thing they've ever seen in their life. I mean, can you imagine that? Oh, come on, guys, that's funny. All right? The hand just writing on the wall and putting these words on the wall. And it's no doubt that it had the attention of everybody. The king has got his attention. And so we see that his face turned pale. His thoughts were terrified him, that he soiled himself and his knees knocked together. It literally scared the mess out of him. See what I did there? Literally scared the mess out of him. Literally. And just in case you haven't picked up on it yet, yes, he peed on himself. That's what happened. One commentator says that his lower extremities were loosened. And I'm going to tell you this, I don't know about you, but for me anyway, if I saw a disembodied hand start writing something on the wall, I would probably do more than pee on myself. And I think you would too. But let's not overlook the seriousness of this moment. It's funny, but it's also not really that funny. Because in this text, the Most High God, the God of the universe, is confronting this pagan king. He is coming to grips with who the Most High God is. And not only does he confront him, but he literally brings him to his knees. If you look up the way that translates in that text, it basically says that his lower body collapsed. And so we see that his face is turned pale, his thoughts were terrified, and his lower body loses strength. Church, if we see anything here, it is this, that no matter how powerful we think we are, no matter how powerful we think we are in this life, no matter what we build up, we do not stand in comparison to the God of this universe. Amen. He will break and buckle us whenever he wants to. And so here we see the most powerful ruler, at least for the next few hours or so, in the known world at that time, overcome with fear and extreme panic, and is confronted with an almighty God. And we too should be terrified at the thought of God confronting us for sin in our life. And I believe that for many Christians today, we don't even flinch at the thought of God confronting us for our sin. And you may say, well, Pastor Andrew, how can you say that? How do you say that? Well, let's just look at statistics. Pornography is just as bad among Christians as it is for non-Christians. The divorce rate and the acceptance of that is on the rise within the Christian church. We also see that same-sex marriage is becoming widely accepted among many Christian denominations. Not accepted in the Southern Baptist Convention, but it is accepted and is becoming more common. And so literally what we're beginning to do is not only are we going on and living and doing the things that we think that we should just do in our own life, pursuing the pleasures that only this world can offer you, temporary pleasures. What we see is that we seem to elevate ourselves to the place of God where we begin to determine what is sin based on our personal preferences, based on our own opinions. Brothers and sisters, that is a dangerous game to play. That is a very dangerous game to play. God does not want you to be a casual Christian. He does not want us to be casual Christians. He wants us to be fully devoted and a follower of Him. Therefore, what is it going to take for us to wake up and stop playing games with God? Because what God's doing here is He is confronting, and I truly believe that He's confronting this pagan king in a way where he has a choice to make. But we're going to see that he doesn't make the right choice. The thought of God confronting us should drive us to our knees. And not only should that thought scare us and drive us to our knees, but it should motivate us to flee from sin in our life and truly begin to follow Him. Now, I know that we're not going to be perfect on this side of eternity. It's not going to happen, but we should be striving to be. And I think what we're starting to see now is that more and more Christians tend to lean so much on, well, God will forgive me for this anyway. God still has a standard for us, even those of us who are in Christ. Yeah. We are to be like Him, to grow like him. We're to be a disciple. What is a disciple? A lifelong learner. When you learn things, it doesn't do good to keep things up here. We've got to apply those things to our life. But it's not about following our preference and our opinions. Let's pick it up and we'll look at verse 7. We see that the king is in this state of panic. And he calls in all his PhDs, his wise men, and all these people to bring in this interpretation, which, by the way, did they not learn yet that these guys are useless? They're useless. Every time he calls them in, Nebuchadnezzar calls them in twice. They can't do anything. Then we see Belshazzar. He calls them in. Nothing. But anyway, if you don't succeed, try again, right? Daniel 5:7. The king shouted, "Bring in the Medians, the Chaldeans, the diviners." He said to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this inscription and gives me its interpretation will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around his neck, and have the third highest position in the kingdom." So purple is a sign of royalty. So wealth and royalty in the Bible. Gold chain, that's same thing. But then what we see is that weird statement of the third highest ruler in the kingdom. What's that about? Well, a lot of people believe that Nebuchadnezzar's father or son wasn't actually dead. He was just kind of off doing his own thing, and he had given the kings of the kingdom over to his son. So therefore, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson is the one who's in control. And so whoever can interpret this dream will be the third highest person in the kingdom behind Belshazzar's dad, himself, and then you've got whoever interprets it. So let's keep going. Verse 8 says, "All the wise men came in." Go figure, but none could read the inscription or make its interpretation known. Then King Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face turned pale. His nobles were bewildered. So here's what we see out of this section right here. Very easy, very clear. That King Belshazzar had been confronted by a holy God for sin in his life, and he was left trembling. And so the question that we have here is, are we left trembling? Do we tremble at the thought of God confronting us for our sin? Do we tremble at the thought of God confronting us for our sin? So we see that God sees our sin, God confronts our sin. Number 3, God exposes our sin. He exposes it. Not long after that section, what we see is that the queen comes onto the scene. Many believe that this is not Nebuchadnezzar's wife, the queen, but this is actually his grandmother. So this would have been Nebuchadnezzar's wife, comes into the scene, and she approaches him respectfully, and then she goes to give him some advice. So let's pick it up in verse 11. It said, "There is a man in your kingdom who has a spirit of the holy gods in him. In the days of your predecessor, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him to the chief of the magicians, the Medians, the Chaldeans, the diviners. Your own predecessor, the king, did this because Daniel, the one the king named Belshazzar, was found to have an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, intelligence, and the ability to interpret dreams and explain riddles and solve problems. Therefore, summon Daniel, and he will give the interpretation." I have a question. This is the part where you guys can participate back. Who is it that each time things hit the fan, things go crazy, who do they call? Daniel, right? Mark said it first, I think. All right, I don't have anything to give you, Mark, I'm sorry. But here's what I want to point out, and I think we can miss this, is that as soon as things go crazy, Daniel is always the one they turn to. Why? Think about that for a second, and we'll answer that question. Because as we mentioned last week, Daniel had a close relationship with King Nebuchadnezzar. And I believe, many people agree with me, some people don't agree with this, but I believe that Daniel played a very important role in the conversion of Nebuchadnezzar. Because I truly believe when we get to heaven, Nebuchadnezzar is going to be there hanging out too. But remember, they called Daniel in Daniel 2, Daniel 4, and now we see Daniel being called in number 5. What does that tell us? It tells us that Daniel is approachable, but not only is he approachable, but he is also respected. And I want us to think about that for a moment. Here's a guy that is an exile. He's an exile in a foreign land. Daniel was in a country that he was in complete disagreement with the leadership, and they knew that. He lived his life in complete contradiction to what the Babylonians did. He did not worship their gods, but he was known for the worship of Yahweh. So here's this exile, considered an outsider in their eyes, had the utmost respect of these leaders in that area. Interesting. He was found to have insight, intelligence, and wisdom of the gods. Daniel was known for his character that reflected his faith. And sometimes I wonder, how does the outside world look at us as believers? What image are we portraying? Because it seems more often than not, when I go on social media, or when I look at the news, or apparently go to the Dogwood Festival yesterday, what I heard from one of my students, what we see is Christians today want to go into attack and debate mode when somebody disagrees with them. However, if we learn anything from the life of Daniel, it's this, that Daniel remained calm even in the most difficult situation. Why? Like we talked about last week, because he knew that God was sovereign and that God was in control over all things. So, do lost people see us that way? Are we known for our character that results in our faith in God? Because that's something to think about, because I'm telling you, if all we're going to do is snap back at people and go after people just because those people don't follow or believe in the things that we do, you will never, ever have a shot of seeing them come to know Christ. Because you're going to keep pushing them further and further away. And that also means the leaders that we have in this country. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's jump back in first. So King Belshazzar calls in Daniel, and at this point, Daniel's about 80 years old. Daniel's 80 years old, and he's old. He's probably, a lot of people think he was retired. A lot of people think that when he was called in, he was just kind of out doing his own thing. Again, 20-some years have passed. And so the king lets Daniel know that, hey, whoever provides this interpretation for me, you're going to get these royalties. I'm going to put purple clothes on you. I'm going to put a gold chain around your neck. And also, you'll be the third highest ruler in the kingdom. But before he does that, he also tells him, leading up to that, he's like, by the way, all my people couldn't interpret this. And Daniel's probably like, yeah, no kidding. They're useless. And so here's Daniel's response. Daniel answers him in verse 17. He said, you may keep your gifts and give the rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription for the king and make the interpretation known to him. And as one commentator noted, Daniel most likely refused that offer of royalties and riches, not out of pride or rudeness, but in order to alleviate any misconception that God's services could be bought. Amen. And to avoid obligation to the king. And so this is a good illustration for us, is to remain faithful to God's word, regardless of how harsh the message may be. And I think this is also a good example of what we see of discipleship, of having people in our lives and people that surround us that are willing to speak into our lives, even whenever we don't necessarily want to hear what they have to say. And so we see Daniel being that person, being that faithful man of God, standing in that position, not rude, not upset, nothing, and saying, hey, here's what it is. And this message he's about to deliver is harsh. Look at verse 18. He said, Your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty to your predecessor Nebuchadnezzar. Because of the greatness he gave them, all the peoples, nations, and languages were terrified and fearful of him. He killed anyone he wanted and kept alive anyone he wanted. He exalted anyone he wanted and he humbled anyone he wanted. But when his heart was exalted and his spirit became arrogant, he was disposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. Verse 21, he was driven away from people. His mind was like an animal. He lived with wild donkeys. He fed on grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky until he acknowledged that the Most High God is ruler over human kingdoms and sets anyone he wants over them. That's Daniel chapter 4. That's what we covered last week. But we see here another reminder that God appoints people in leadership who God puts into leadership. And so that means that Joe Biden is in office because God put Joe Biden there. Donald Trump was in office because God put him there. And every leader and ruler, no matter how wicked, no matter if you agree with them, it doesn't matter if you disagree with them, God put them there. Yes, God even put the extreme dictators of this world in North Korea, of people that I just don't understand and why people do such horrible things like we see in the Middle East, those people into power because God placed them there. God sets he is the ruler over human kingdoms and sets anybody he wants over them. And that goes any leader on the planet. This, again, it includes everybody. And so remember that God has exiled his people and he gave them over to wicked rulers. And why has he done that? Because God does these things as a result of their wickedness and rebellion against God. And so when God's people get to the point where they say that, hey, I don't need God, I don't have time for God, it seems to me like in the Bible, he has no problem at all of sending people or giving his people over to wicked rulers as a result of the sin in their life. Yeah. Some of y'all are going to be upset that I even went there. It's fine. Email Pastor Jeff. But no matter the circumstances, and that would have been, and this is a good warning for us today, but I believe that the exiles were beginning to understand this, that no matter the circumstances, again, a continual theme in the book of Daniel is God's sovereignty, that he is over everything. And so regardless of how we see it, regardless of our opinion, regardless of how jacked up we think somebody's leading, God placed them there. And we have to just trust that. And we trust that he's sovereign. He's sovereign then, here we see in Daniel 5, and he is sovereign now. And Daniel continues in verse 22. He says, but you, this is where it gets interesting, but you, his successor, Belshazzar, you've not humbled your heart. And even though you knew all of this, instead you have exalted yourself against the Lord of the heavens. The vessels from the house were brought to you, and as your nobles and wives and concubines drank from them, you praised gods made of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you do not see or hear or understand. But you have glorified the God who holds your life breath. Think about that. You have not glorified the God who holds your life breath. Talk about God's sovereignty. And then his hand who controls the whole counsel of your life. Therefore, he sent the hand and the writing of what was inscribed. And then Daniel gives the interpretation that we just read moments ago. Verse 26, this is the interpretation of the message. He says, Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighed on the balance and found deficient. And then Parsin means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so what we see here is that God exposes the sins of this wicked king. And what we see here is that when God exposes the sins of this wicked king, that this king was found deficient. And Belshazzar was lacking, deficient in moral worth. See, God's moral laws were laid on one side of the scale and his were laid on the other. And he didn't measure up to God's standard of righteousness. And so what we see here is that this proud king who never repented of his sin, never humbled himself or asked God for salvation, and we see that God steps in and he's getting ready to do a work in this guy's life, not for the good. And so brothers and sisters, here's the reality that we see, that no matter our accomplishments, no matter the power, no matter the works, no matter the money, no matter how good of a person that we may be in this life, the reality is that all of us will stand before God. All of us will stand before God in judgment, and we'll have to give an account for our life. And just like Belshazzar, if we do not bow down trusting that God is sovereign over all things, and I mean all things, that he is truly sovereign over all things, and that he's truly the Most High God, then we too will be found deficient. Amen. And let us not make the mistake of this king. May we take note of the warning of God. The handwriting is on the wall. God sees our sin, and he brings judgment to those who remain unrepentant. And then finally, we see that God rightly judges our sin. So he sees our sin, he confronts our sin, he exposes it, and then now we see that he rightly judges our sin. The last two verses of the chapter in Daniel 5, 29 through 31 says this. Then Belshazzar gave an order, and they clothed Daniel in purple, placed the gold chain around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. And just like that, there is the fall of the great Babylonian Empire. Didn't take long. Only took a few moments. The king ends up giving Daniel the promotion, but the problem is this kind of promotion is like being put in CEO of a company, and then all of a sudden you find out that just a few moments after you've been given the promotion of being CEO of this company, the company's going out of business and filing for bankruptcy. And so it crumbles down in a matter of moments. The Babylonian Empire is over, Belshazzar is killed, and just like that, an empire done. And as I read that, I have to wonder if Belshazzar maybe thought that God wasn't going to keep his word. Maybe he just kind of blew it off and just said, no, I get it, that's fine, that dream's okay. Kind of like what Nebuchadnezzar did in chapter 4. But what we do see here is that God does keep his word. And I think often we forget that God keeps his word. And what I mean by that is that we go on playing games with God and living our lives and in selfishness and in our pride, and we'll say, you know what, I'll just get right with God later. I'll just do it later. I'll settle that score later. I'm going to do whatever I want. The problem with that statement is that there may not be a later. Belshazzar was killed. What God said would happen, it happened. Was there time for repentance? Did Belshazzar, in the ensuing hours of his death, cry out to God, acknowledge God's sovereignty over it, that God is God? We don't know that, but here's what I do know. I know that he died, and I know that he did exactly what happened was exactly what God said was going to happen. And so there's really two key takeaways that I take out of this last section. The first one is this. We see a reminder that God keeps his promises. And that would have had to be a major encouragement to the exiles living in Babylon. Because remember, we can't interpret this text. We can't look at it and think, how does it apply to them to get to how does it apply to us? Well, when we think about it, they're exiled in a foreign land, and then all of a sudden they see that God is continuing to do exactly what he said he was going to do. And in fact, if you go back a little bit further, you see in the book of Isaiah and even in the book of Jeremiah, I believe, where this right here fulfills those prophets. So it's very interesting. God is showing them favor in the midst of difficult circumstances. So God, too, shows us favor in the midst of difficult circumstances. But then the second thing that we see there is that the reality of the judgment of God, and the reality that God deals rightly with our sin. God looked at this prideful king, and he let him know that he was deficient in his eyes. Therefore, this king's fate was sealed as a result of his own doing. God's judgment is real, folks. And we see here that when he casts his judgment, he always does it rightly because God is a just God. The king challenged the Most High God, and it was no contest. He was confronted with his sin, showed no repentance, and then God took him out. This kind of reminds me of the old Proverbs 29:1, where it says, the one who becomes stiff-necked after many reprimands will be shattered instantly beyond recovery. When God brings his final judgment, he does it quick. He does it swiftly, and it's also inescapable. So the handwriting's on the wall. God sees our sin. God brings his judgment for those who remain unrepentant. So the question that we end with here today is this. What is it going to take to wake us up? Been asking myself that question all week. What is it going to take to wake me up? Guys, this is a hard message to preach. No one wants to sit and hear 30 minutes or 35 minutes of God's wrath and judgment. But I'm so thankful that he does give us that in his word, because it's through that he shows us how we can turn back to him. God's judgment's coming. Ready or not, it's going to come. And when he does it rightly. So God sees our sin. God confronts our sin. God exposes our sin, and then God rightly judges our sin. God sees our sin, and he brings judgment on those who choose to remain unrepentant. On September 11th, 2001, a day that many of us will never, ever forget, American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon near the office of a Lieutenant Brian Birdwell. And when recounting the events, this is what he said. He said the hallway in which he was walking was immediately enveloped in flame, and an 80-ton aircraft traveling 520 miles an hour struck the building. The force of the impact knocked him from his feet, and he temporarily lost consciousness. He awoke surrounded by fire, on fire, without orientation. And he said that he knew that he was facing a ghastly death and wanted to flee, but didn't know which direction to run. So he ducked his head and he ran, screaming, "Jesus, I'm coming to see you." So that way, whether he was running toward his life or whether he was running for his death, that he knew he was heading in the right direction either way. So it turned out to be the right direction as he would get out. So here, are you guys ready for the encouragement? It's been a lot of rough stuff here. Here's the encouragement. We don't have to wonder which direction to run. By God's grace and mercy, he paved the way for us by sending his son, Jesus, to live a perfect life to die as a perfect sacrifice so that we could truly be cleansed of our sin and shame. I love what Pastor Brian Chappell writes. He says that God shows consequences so that we will not experience them. Judgment need not to be our destiny, whatever our lives, whatever the evil that we have allowed or are being consumed by, there is a direction to run, and we must run to a Savior. When we do, He will receive us, hold us, and help us. He loves us enough to point to the consequences of sin and say, Mene, Tekel, Parson. God's calling out to us today. And what He's saying is this: don't keep going that way. Do not go in the direction of King Belshazzar. Come and follow me. Surrender to me, whatever that may be. If God loves us enough to warn us, then He loves us enough to receive us when we turn to Him. So church, the handwriting's on the wall. God sees our sin, and He brings His judgment on those who remain unrepentant. And so honestly, the choice is yours. The free gift of salvation is right there. Cry out to Him. Surrender to Him. Whatever difficulty situation, whatever trial, struggle, or whatever sin that you may be caught up in, He's ready to receive you. He's ready to meet you there in that moment. We just have to turn and come to Him. Let's pray together. Father, You love us enough to warn us. You love us enough to give us passages like this one. And Father, why it may be so difficult to hear, it's difficult to preach, it's difficult to apply, Father, You meet us right where we're at. Father, we thank You for Your grace and Your love that's found in Jesus. And Lord, I long for the day where we can stand with You, not have to worry about the stresses of this world, the pressures of this world. But Father, while we're here, may we strive to serve You and honor You in this time that You've placed us all here for a purpose. And may each day we strive to grow closer to You by leaning on You, not leaning on our own understanding, but leaning solely on You, the Most High God, the truly sovereign God. It's got everything under control. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.